Neuroscape is a cyberpunk indie trading card game that just launched its Kickstarter on May the 1st of 2025. I've gotten plenty of emails asking me to take a look at various upcoming indie trading card game releases, and a lot of them are really interesting looking. I've wanted to make some space to review a few of them for a while now. Since I'm a sucker for cyberpunk and the space kind of opened up now, Neuroscape just happened to hit the inbox at just the right time. Before I get into what I think of the game or even how to play, I want to take a moment to talk about the packaging. I normally skip over unboxing new games since it's usually just a box and there is no shortage of internet videos of people opening boxes, but I do really need to shout out Neuroscape here. I can't think of another trading card game product I've opened that looks this good. It seriously speaks to the care and attention that's been given to this game, and it gives a fantastic first impression. Although, a minor gripe is that you can't put sleeved cards back into the box. So, how do you play in Neuroscape? Decks are 50 to 250 cards for the main cyber deck, then you have an additional 25 card RAM deck, which can include up to 5 non-basic RAM cards, as well as a single mainframe card that acts as a leader. You begin by shuffling both decks and drawing 5 cards from your cyber deck. Then you can mulligan once, putting any number of cards from your hand on the bottom of your deck and then drawing back up to 5. I like this approach to mulligans because it doesn't involve extra shuffling. You begin with 20 mainframe and 20 bioframe life, and your goal is to reduce either of these life totals on your opponent's side down to 0. Turns in Neuroscape start with a stability check. This is when you make sure your characters have enough installed RAM to stick around. More on this later. Next, you enter your refresh substep. This is the familiar untap step where you refresh all of your running cards in play. Then you get to a draw step where you draw a total of 2 cards or resources. So you can draw 2 cards, play out 2 resources, or draw a card and play out a resource. Note that you do this one at a time, so you can draw one card and then see what it is before deciding if you need another resource or would rather just draw another card. The first turn player only gets one of these draw or ram plays on their first turn. To round out this start of turn step, you can force quit a character to reclaim their installed RAM as refreshed. Again, more on this later. After start of turn procedures are out of the way, next you hit the deploy step. This is when you get to play out characters, programs, and cyberware. If you're familiar with Magic the Gathering, programs and cyberwares are your basic sorceries and enchantments. One is generally discarded after playing its effect, although there are a few that stick around, and the other one sticks in play. To play these cards, you just run the cost in RAM. Characters, however, are a little bit different. You still run the cost in RAM to play them, but then you have to commit that RAM to the character by placing it underneath that character. The character holds onto that RAM until it leaves play. When the character leaves play, the RAM then returns to the field as running. This is where force quit at the start of your turn comes in. You can discard a character to get its RAM back as refreshed, which lets you free up some resources if you'll need them for the upcoming turn. If for some reason the amount of RAM under a character goes below its cost, you then need to move as much RAM back from your RAM pool as possible to cover it. If there's not enough, it remains in play, but during the stability check at the start of your turn, there's a 50-50 chance of it being discarded from play, which is determined by a d20 roll. Note that characters will generally have one or more activated abilities they can use, and, unless otherwise stated, they're all instant speed, called Swift in this game, so they can be activated on either player's turn. Each character, however, can only use one ability per round, so if you use an ability, even if it doesn't run the character, you still need to wait until your next initialize step before you're able to use it again. Once you have characters in play, you can start adding cyberware to them. Each character has slots on their card for different cyberware, and the slots determine the power of the card you're able to attach. Each slot can only take one cyberware, so it neatly avoids the Jace of many shoes problem, but more relevantly, it also means that your opponent can't put a mind control helmet on somebody who's already wearing headgear. Cyberware can add all kinds of effects, such as power and defense buffs, and they'll often give characters additional abilities as well. Note that any abilities that are printed on cyberware are given to the character, not locked into the cyberware, so that means that they will become limited by the one ability per character per round limit. In addition to cyberware, some programs attach themselves to your mainframe and then stick in play. These programs use one of the 3 available mainframe slots But your opponent is also able to deploy viruses and trojans into these slots, so be careful not to let your opponent fill your mainframe with viruses if you want to be installing programs of your own there. After the deploy step, there is a quick net check phase, which is basically like an upkeep. If something says it happens during net check, it happens, otherwise we skip on through to combat. Getting into combat, if you've played Magic the Gathering, this is all going to be pretty familiar. Although, this game doesn't appear to have summoning sickness, so your characters are able to attack the turn that they're played. You declare your attackers by running them, then your opponent decides if and how to block. Refreshed characters only are able to get in the way of attackers and block them, and much like Magic, multiple defenders can be assigned to a single attacker. Characters then deal damage equal to their power to each other, and any characters with damage that is equal or greater than their defense is discarded along with any cyberware equipped to them. Any characters that go unblocked deal damage directly to the opponent's life, and the color of their power stat will determine whether the damage is bioframe or mainframe damage. Most decks are generally going to focus on one type of damage only. Finally, the turn ends with a reset step where damage is cleared out from characters, and the turn is then passed over to the opponent. The game has quite a lot of swift effects, so you'll still have plenty to do even during the opponent's turn. So that's a quick overview of how to play Neuroscape. More importantly, how does it all come together as a game? Is the gameplay worthy of the admittedly very impressive packaging? I'll start by saying that the overall system is very solid. It's not exceptionally unique, it feels very Magic the Gathering, with traps and field spells borrowed from Yu-Gi-Oh!, and a twist on the Battle Spirits resource system, but all of this comes together quite well. I really want to get this point out in front, because while a lot of my notes from playing the game focus on things that don't quite come together or I think can be improved on, the overall flow of the game is still very good here. The pacing feels just right, the games have a lot of meaningful decision points and interaction, and between the factions and the two types of damage, the game does a good job of making deck building fairly open while also steering players towards specific archetypes and deck silos. But instead of talking about the lack of friction, let's get into the points where I did feel a bit of friction here. To start, there are a couple of points that feel like they didn't come together quite as well as was probably intended. For one, the stability check mechanic, and having to allocate extra RAM if the installed RAM on a character drops below their cost, feels a bit like mana burn in Magic the Gathering, in that it's a very flavorful rule that is theoretically interesting, but practically it just ends up as extra rules baggage that I think the game would be just fine without. Indeed, I think getting rid of it would actually open up some design space for effects that use installed RAM as a resource, a bit like Xyz material in Yu-Gi-Oh! It looks like there may be more cards in the booster set that take advantage of stability checks, but even then, I feel like it just adds a coin flip to what already works as an interesting take on a delayed resource denial effect. The draw system in Neuroscape has some downsides. While it's great that you don't ever get screwed or flooded by variance and bad luck, it also keeps the early turns of the game just a little too stagnant. For an alternative example, in One Piece you draw 2 resources and draw 1 card per turn, which means that between drawing that 1 card per turn and drawing your life cards as you take damage, by turn 3 you're likely to have seen 5 new cards on top of your 5 card starting hand. Meanwhile in Neuroscape you're most likely focusing your early turns on building resources exclusively, so by turn 3 you're still staring at the same 5 cards you started with. From there, the decision tree does branch out quite a bit, and you get to really take advantage of the freedom of Neuroscape's draw system, but these early turns do lack a bit of excitement without the uncertainty of a guaranteed once per turn draw. I am willing to forgive it here, since it does work quite well in later turns, and it does play into the somewhat oppressive flavor of cyberpunk as a genre, but it does sap some of the excitement from the early game in exchange for this. Neuroscape does have dice rolling mechanics, and I am not a huge fan of them here. They feel very coin flippy. Psychosis is an especially egregious offender, since whenever a psychotic character attempts to attack, block, or use an ability, you roll a psychosis check, and if the roll isn't higher than their psychosis score, not only is the action negated, but the character also hits you in the face for their power value. This is a pretty huge and random downside, and it's made worse by the fact that a lot of Psychosis cards also give huge power boosts, which makes it especially painful when they fail and hit you in the face. A lot of things I'm mentioning here are things that I think can be incrementally improved, but I'm just really not a fan of Psychosis and the implementation of dice rolling that I've seen so far, full stop. Another issue I ran into playing this game is that it feels a little bit too magic-coded. In the limited gameplay I was able to experience with the starter decks that I had, it feels like the game hewed a little too closely to Magic, particularly at the level of individual card design. For one example, looking at the early rulebook, the keywords mentioned in the glossary are Stamina, Psychosis, Overrun, Biovamp and Datavamp, and Bleed. All of these are very standard with the exception of Bleed, which is an interesting take on -1/-1 counters, and while they're functional and very useful to have in a Magic-inspired game system, they don't really tell you much about what this game is trying to do differently. For example, there's no keyword listed that relates to cyber gear, one of the more unique points in the game. Having different slots for heads, limbs, and body equipment is very cool and flavorful, and it's neat that they give you a way to build board power that doesn't take resources out of use like assigning them to characters will. But the removal so far feels a little bit too Magic adjacent to really support this as a strategy. It takes a surprising amount of commitment to make Aura-type cards work as a strategy because of their inherent card disadvantage, and with powerful removal running around like Shock, Big Shock, and outright Murder, I don't think this game has shown quite enough commitment to balancing them out as a viable option. I realize this is just the first set, but having a keyword for cyber gear, for one example, perhaps something like Inherit, where you draw a card whenever the equipped character leaves play, could help and give a more clear signal that equips are not just an archetype on their own, but they're an important part of the game worth adding to any deck. Mainframe effects that only activate when you have a threshold of that faction in play are similarly heavily punished by powerful removal effects, and it feels like the balance here may have erred a little bit too closely to the standards established by Magic to make some of these mechanics work quite as smoothly as they should. Ultimately, as I've played more games and gotten more familiar with Neuroscape, I've been enjoying the gameplay a lot more than this video might let on. While there are some aspects that feel like they don't work quite as well as they should, the overall gameplay is very solid. It has a good sense of pacing, plenty of interaction and decision points, and a good variety of strategies to explore, all on top of great presentation. These are the things that you really want a trading card game to get right, and as long as it does, any lingering rough edges can be sanded down and refined as the game develops. Neuroscape's rules do borrow heavily from Magic, but this is very safely on the level of inspiration and not an imitation. The start of turn draw gives players more options in the later stages of the game. The resource system and plentiful activated abilities and spell effects all create an interesting tension between board development and board exploitation and management, and the lack of summoning sickness and the powerful mainframe effects give the game a sharper and more intense pace. Although this is a bit of an odd comparison, for me, Neuroscape ended up in a very similar place to the HoloLive trading card game. It's not quite exceptional or unique enough to recommend to just everyone, and there are some places where I do wish they went a little further to distance themselves from their inspiration, but they're both very well designed games that are fun to play, have a lot of depth, and are a solid recommendation if you're a fan of their aesthetic niche. Although I think Neuroscape is a more ambitious and complex game than HoloLive, so I do think the gameplay does have a bit more potential here, although in exchange there are less anime girls. I'm interested in seeing where Neuroscape goes with the first booster set added to the mix, and if the points I've raised here carry through, are addressed, or if they even end up being issues at all. Let me know what you think of the game from what you've seen so far, and if you're so inclined, I've included a link to their Kickstarter in the description below. Either way, follow the White Rabbit, and have a fantastic day.